All right. Hi, everybody. Hello to everybody watching this on the recording as well, too. So I think we're now on week 6 of HCDE's Research Speaker Series. So today we have, I practice it, Blair Subbaraman, who is a PhD candidate in HCDE. He is a research member of the Machine Agency Lab led by Professor Nadia Peek. And he will be talking to us today about automation for insight and how you can use things like digital fabrication for creativity and other sorts of things. So with that, I'll hand it over to Blair.
Well, thanks, Julie. How's that? Is that close enough to me? No? Maybe there? Well, it's a small group, so feel free to cut me off during the presentation if you have questions. You can ask me whatever. But I'm going to talk a little bit today about digital fabrication machines, like 3D printers. And for all the promises of the Star Trek replicator and visions of distributed manufacturing, a lot of the times when we're using machines like 3D printers today, it's really not so different than using the usual inkjet printers that we're all accustomed to. So they usually just get the job done. They physicalize some digital model, except for all the times that they don't, and the printer clogs and jams and breaks, in which case you have a bunch of really frustrating troubleshooting and debugging to go through. But what I hope to convince you of a little bit over the course of this talk is that machines like these can actually be used to generate insights. So they can be used by scientists to help run experiments and develop new materials, and they can be used by artists to create bespoke art pieces and craft products. But to use automation for insight in this way, I think requires not just a rebranding about machines, but kind of fundamentally rethinking how we design for emerging practices with machines, and relatedly, how we design for emerging communities of practice that are growing around machines. And so to set the scene at a high level, I want to start with the seemingly simple task of trying to 3D print a line. And if we wanted to do this, we could maybe see if somebody else has already designed a line that we could use. So in this video, I'm on the website Thingiverse, which is the largest online repository of models for fabrication. And I search for a single line, and I get a bunch of results. But about 3 years ago, usefully, this guy named DJ Tron uploaded a model of a line. And I can look at this line and see what DJ Tron used it for. And if I like what I see, I can download the file that he provided, which is an STL file, or a digital model that represents the line geometry. But we still have to convert this into some instruction we can run on our machine. And in 3D printing, we do that in software called a slicer. Called a slicer because it takes a 3D object and slices it up into a bunch of 2D layers in order to create a three-dimensional object. So here I brought the line into a slicer, and when I try to make some machine instructions, I actually end up with this error, that the print is empty and the model's not printable with the current print settings. And to debug a problem like this, we have to start rummaging through all the different settings that a slicer makes available to us. And that's what I'm doing in this video here. And there's no feedback from the machine back into this software, which means that all of these settings have to be really carefully hand-tuned up front in order for the whole process to work. And in different industrial applications, it's literally someone's full-time job to optimize all these parameters. And we could probably fix the problem we ran into with that line. And if we did, then the slicer would generate some G-code, which looks like the list of coordinates shown here that the machine should pass through in making this object. And then maybe we could start stacking up a bunch of lines to make a three-dimensional object like this boat. But my point with this is that all these layers of abstraction that a slicer is introducing are stifling our ability to explore. So in order just to make my line, I had to know that I was printing a particular material, a thermoplastic that was suitable for 3D printing, on a particular machine that had all sorts of limits on the speeds and accelerations it could hit. And that might all be fine if your machine and your material aren't really changing. But as soon as something goes wrong, or you want to incorporate some new machine or new process into your workflow, it becomes extremely difficult to debug or modify all these settings, especially because these settings are totally estranged from what's physically happening on your machine. And so when I see G-code, that's shown on the slide here, I'm reminded of this maxim from computer scientist and mathematician Richard Hamming, who wrote that the purpose of computing is insight, not numbers. And he wrote this in the 1960s when computers were often used just to run large calculations. And his point was that the results you get out of a computer aren't just ready to be interpreted directly, but rather your choice of algorithms or techniques for analyzing some data are intimately bound up with the source of the problem. He went on to write that, quote, computing is, or at least should be, intimately bound up with both the source of the problem and the use that's going to be made of the answers. It's not a step to be taken in isolation from reality. And so through my research, my argument is that computer-controlled machines today are often used like calculators. They're used to just faithfully reproduce some digital model. But if we could instead change the way we're interacting with machines to integrate automation into different creative practices, we could leverage automation to gain some new insights. So this is my take on how I think we should be able to print a line. So in different systems I build, I try to understand how we can use automation for some insight. Here I'm modifying parameters using this interactive controller in the bottom left, and it's changing various settings on the machine. And if we look from the point of view of a camera that's on the nozzle of this machine, you can see that even though we're just printing the simplest geometry possible, moving along in a straight line, we can find more interesting behavior with the right choice of settings. So at the end of this print here, as I bump up how fast the material is being pushed through this nozzle, it starts being deposited in these really nice, neat, repeatable coils. And that's behavior that you couldn't find with conventional software, which is optimized for just reproducing a digital model. So by changing our interaction with machines, we can start to intuitively respond to machine and material behavior. It turns out things like those coils are used by engineers to create foams with different mechanical properties, like the one shown here. And beyond 3D printing, I also work with scientists who want to do things like automate an experimental process. So scientists might not want to just do additive fabrication like 3D printing or subtractive fabrication like laser cutting, but maybe they want to manipulate samples around and maybe image those samples for subsequent data analysis. And in that sort of context, there's no like slicer, there's no software that's going to choreograph all the machine's motion for you. And in fact, it's really only the scientists themselves who has all the domain expertise that's necessary to understand what the machine should even be doing and how to interpret those results. In a similar way, artists are often exploring material possibilities in their work. But again, current software acts as a wedge between an artist and the machine. And so through my research, I want to understand how different approaches to machine interfaces and interactions can help practitioners from art, science, and beyond use their existing skills in their interactions with machines. So broadly speaking, the objectives of my work are twofold. So I want to make authoring physical processes more like authoring code, which is to say I want it to be a dynamic mode of creative inquiry for insight and expression. Today, a scientist or artist or hobbyist can sit down and start writing some code to accomplish some goal. But if you want to automate a physical process or customize a machine to do something, it takes a ton of expertise across mechanical design, electrical engineering, and computer science. So I want automation to be another tool that people can use to accomplish their goals. And I don't think that first objective can really happen without my second, which is to cultivate some open source community where people can share their automation workflows with one another. So my goal is for practitioners themselves to be collaboratively driving technology development here. To try and accomplish these objectives, I kind of have 3 research avenues. So I incorporate empirical methods to learn from people about their work with machines. And then I use the insights that I gain there as analytic starting points for building hardware and software and new interfaces for machines. And then in analogy to open source software, I try to pay particular attention to how these new tools can be taken up in large online communities. And of course, all these tracks are interdependent, but for this talk today, I'm just going to focus on this center track, on developing fabrication tools, and I'll pepper in some empirical insights from some of my other work along the way. So that's the plan for the rest of this talk. I'm going to introduce some of the fabrication systems I've built. And as I go along, I'm sort of going to naturally build up in scale from designing one workflow for one machine, then think about how we can document these workflows to guide the implementation of future ones. And then at the end, I'm going to speak to large online communities where many different workflows are being run on many different machines. So I'll start with designing new workflows. And to motivate where systems intervention is going to be useful here, I think it's worth looking at just some common issues that people run into. So people, if you've 3D printed before, you've maybe heard of the Benchy model, which is this model of a tugboat that's specifically designed to stress test your printer. So it has areas of unsupported filament, a perfect one shown in the top left here. And it has all these geometric details that you can check for. And then all the other images shown here were uploaded to the subreddit Cursed Benchies, where people share Benchy prints that have gone wrong in some way. And so I always like the accidental errors. Like in the bottom left, this purple Benchy was sliced with a 2mm layer height instead of a 0.2mm layer height, which had the effect of creating this spaghetti on the boat when they printed it. And this is kind of a tongue-in-cheek example, but these Benchies, I think, represent a real problem in digital fabrication, which is keeping a printer's material output aligned with what you expect it to do. So printers break down, parts need to be calibrated and cleaned and repaired and replaced. And this implies a whole host of work that's almost completely overlooked in contemporary digital fabrication software. So in an empirical study, I looked at how practitioners maintain their 3D printers. And I won't dive into all of the details of the paper that we wrote about this, but the key takeaway for the purposes of this talk is that through observations of an online community about printer repair and interviews with some of those people, I argued that maintenance is core to digital fabrication because it provides an opportunity for people to build confidence and expertise with their machines. I think some of the tensions that we saw are captured nicely by this quote from one of our interview participants who had a problem where their printer had jammed and they didn't know how to fix it. And they said that, quote, "I tried all the things like settings in my slicer before I actually went for disassembling stuff because it was kind of scary. The printer was running fine and I felt like if I tinkered with anything, I would make things worse. Now I know it's not that way. It's quite easy. It just takes a couple of screws." So while maintenance is core to digital fabrication, current software is mismatched to the sort of iterative material debugging which maintenance requires. So slicers can obscure fundamentally physical problems by drawing your attention away from the machine and to fiddling with a bunch of digital settings in the interface. And so to intervene in this landscape, I wanted to develop an approach to using machines that was premised on material iteration. And the result of that work is in part shown in this video, where we're watching a printer over-extrude these one-shot blobs and then bridge between them to create this delicate vase structure. And something like this wouldn't be possible to make in conventional CAD and slicer software because we're not working at the level of a full model, but instead we're designing directly in machine toolpaths. So on these blobs that I'm printing, I'm specifying how much filament should be extruded, and the printer's moving in the Z direction out of the XY plane while we're doing that. And we're bridging between them at a speed that's fast enough that the filament doesn't sag, but not so fast that it breaks. And so I made this using a software library for controlling machines called p5.fab, which lets you control machines from the creative coding environment, p5.js. And it tries to offer a different approach to using fabrication machines, where you don't have to have a fully formed idea of what you're making before actually experimenting with a machine. And so we have this base fab object that represents the machine, and it's associated with some useful information, like how big your machine is. And you can do things like move retract to a point, or get to somewhere on your machine without extruding any filament. So you could, for example, get to the center of your machine by using the max X and max Y properties. And then we could extrude some filament using the move extrude command. And maybe you want to specify more details about that, like how fast we should move, or exactly how much material should be extruded over that path. Then we can quickly build up more complicated objects in this way. And to actually send commands, I'm using a wired USB connection between a computer and a 3D printer, so we can stream commands over a serial connection, which means that you can test different geometries and different settings rapidly. And so you can quickly print things you can't with usual software in this way, because we have continuous control over not just geometry, but also all of those settings. So the key contribution here is really these alternative computational abstractions that allow us to directly specify machine behavior in code. I ran some workshops to more formally investigate some of the opportunities and limitations of this approach to using machines. And I ran them with experienced makers who were less comfortable with programming, and then also with experienced programmers who actually use code professionally in their artworks but hadn't 3D printed before. And a key takeaway that I want to emphasize again for this talk is that this creative code-based approach to machine interaction gave experienced coders an entry point into digital fabrication, and it also gave makers an entry point into building some computational expertise. I really like a quote from one of our artist participants who said that, quote, "The layers of abstraction that CAD and slicer software add are really boring to me. So not having to deal with that is so fun. Just give me the primitives." Where here they're talking about the computational primitives used to control the machine. And so as we're developing automation tools for insight, we quickly run into this trilemma between domain expertise, manufacturing expertise, and computational expertise. And the goal is to allow people to gain computational and manufacturing expertise while enacting the domain expertise they already have. And that's what a system like P5.fab tries to speak to. So to build on that some more, in this next project, I'm going to look at another domain, which is using automation to run laboratory science experiments. So laboratory automation can boost reproducibility and the efficiency of different science workflows, but systems are really difficult to modify because automating some new workflow requires scientists to develop a new one-off research platform, which in turn takes a bunch of time, energy, and resources. So in this next project, I asked how we can develop extensible open source automation systems that scientists can build and extend themselves. And as a case study, I specifically looked at plant biology workflows with a small aquatic plant called duckweed, which the little green things show in this slide. And if you want to run a fully fledged scientific experiment, you might have to do more than just 3D print. And so instead, we're using an open source tool changing machine that was developed by another PhD student in my lab. And using it, we can pick up different tools, and then we could stitch together multi-tool workflows. And so I developed some tools relevant for laboratory science, some of which are shown here. There's a little plastic loop that's used to pick up small plants and move them around. There's a couple of different syringes that are used to feed these plants different food through different media. And then there's a couple of different cameras to image plants from different angles. And while these tools were developed with plant biology in mind, they're sort of broadly applicable to other laboratory science workflows. And so where P5.fab was a software intervention, here we see how we need synchronized development of hardware, software, and all the documentation that people need to build these tools and then use them. And in particular, once you build some new tool, you also need some way to control it. There's no existing software there to do that off the bat. And so where P5.fab provided programmatic control from a creative coding environment, here I set up programmatic control from a computational notebook environment. So computational notebooks, if you're not familiar with them, let you write blocks of code alongside plain language explanations. And they're heavily used in data science to explore new data sets. And here I'm interested in how an alternative computational environment can help people experiment with different machine behaviors and machine settings when setting up experiments. And so I paired each of those new tools with some Python module. Like here is a pipette that's used for precise liquid handling, and it's transferring a small volume of liquid using the code block shown in the top left. And then we can use these code modules to integrate some computation into our automation workflow. So here I've moved some of those plants into containers on this machine, and I've picked up a camera tool. And then if we look from the point of view of the camera, you can see that I've just outlined the contours of these plants using simple computer vision. And this sort of straightforward image analysis could then be integrated into experiments on the fly. So a scientist could use these data streams to write some quality control rules, maybe by looking at how green the plants are to see if they're dying. Or they could differentially manipulate samples depending on, say, the frond area or their growth rate. And so the key takeaway here is that with these modules, a scientist could author computationally enriched workflows that integrate some of their disciplinary expertise into their experiment. And so I put this all together in a case study where we ran duckweed experiments, watching different types of duckweed grow in different environments over a couple of week period. But more generally, a couple of other duckweed labs have built their machines with the relevant tools for running these experiments. And the Python code that's used to control the machine is being continuously updated by myself and others for other laboratory automation contexts. And if we come back to this expertise diagram, in this process, I really start to see how important building open source community is in resolving this trilemma. Because every lab that's built one of these machines has a unique set of problems almost by definition, because every experiment is going to be one-off. But we have to find ways to reduce the amount of effort that any one individual needs to put in to be able to share the knowledge that we're gaining with each other. And that brings me to the next major requirement in developing automation tools for insight, which is being able to document the work that we're doing to share with other people. And to think about documentation, we can first think about a machine workflow that is really hard to document. And so this panel of buttons and knobs and sliders on the left is a MIDI controller. It's commonly used in live musical performances. And it's hooked off screen to my laptop, which is running a modified version of that p5.fab software. And the idea is that we can tie different knobs on this controller to different machine settings to be able to modify them while the printer is running. So by queuing commands on our software side, we can not worry about buffering things on our machine, which means we can start controlling things in something like real time. And so by combining those computational abstractions from p5.fab with this real-time interaction technique, we can draw that line that I showed at the beginning of the presentation. And what I want to focus on now, though, is when I was exploring this, I found this coiling behavior of this material. But it's not totally clear how I could share this with another person. The coils that I'm making are really sensitive to how high the machine is from the bed when it's being deposited, how fast the machine is moving, and how quickly I'm pushing this material out of the machine. And that, in turn, is dependent on a whole bunch of other material factors, like what material I'm using and what sort of state my machine is in. And so I don't have a canonical model that I can share anymore. And actually sharing just a line with you wouldn't be terribly useful in reproducing this, because what I really want to communicate is this dynamic material behavior that I found. And so to approach this, we can think of material exploration and material documentation as two sides of the same coin. So as we're exploring some new material's behavior, we're also generating some insight about that material. So this is an example of how we can use that MIDI interface to find different coiling patterns, where the graph at the bottom is a recording of some different settings I was playing with over the course of the print up at the top. And as I changed some settings, I was able to get this sinusoidal pattern that's shown up at the top in the orange circle. And then I could find coils that alternated reliably from side to side by using this green pattern in the middle. And then if I changed things up a lot, I could get these big loops that are shown down at the bottom. But kind of critically, I want to be able to tie interesting sets of parameters to what's actually happening on the machine at any given time. And so to do that, I synchronized video of the machine while it's running with the machine instruction that's being executed at that timestamp, the JavaScript code that generated that machine instruction, and any of real-time adjustments that we're making. And so the idea here is that we can have a transcription of the print job that we could refer back to and share with other people. So that's shown in this interface here, where if I scrub forward or backward in the video or select different lines of machine instruction, all the other views will update in lockstep, and I can try and figure out what was happening at that point in time. And so I kind of like to think about this as like auto-documentation for physical processes. And when you're writing software, programmers can write short comments that will automatically generate some API documentation that's useful for other programmers to understand how to use that piece of code. And similarly here, as we're exploring some material behavior, we can automatically generate some documentation that might be useful for other people as a natural byproduct of the exploration process. This approach is, I think, broadly useful whenever you're incorporating some new material or technique into a digital fabrication process. So in this slide, I'm showing a hydrogel, which is a liquid when it's cold, but when it warms up, you can print it. And so in the top left here, you can see that this material is sort of oozing out of the syringe when it's too cool to print. And just doing a simple thing like printing a line with this material can be really tricky at first, because there's no settings out there that you can just use by default. And this gets even harder when you're iterating on the composition of the material itself, which is something that material scientists are often do when they're coming up with some new material formulation. And I think this is captured nicely in a quote from a material science paper, where they're talking about the challenges of incorporating these new materials. And they write that, quote, "This is know-how that's not openly shared or discussed in depth, but that's critical for success." And that kind of sets me up for the last part then of trying to build automation tools for insight, which is thinking about how we can distribute all these workflows that we're making with other people. And I want to start to think about this actually not in the world of digital fabrication, but in the world of end-user programming, and specifically with creative code. So if you're not familiar with creative coding tools, there's creative coding libraries like p5.js, which is shown here. And they help practitioners write code to create some visual output. And they've been extremely influential. So p5.js, for example, has millions of users that are comprised of students all the way through professional artists who are exhibiting their work in galleries. And not only do many people learn to code this way, both informally and online, and increasingly they're being incorporated into undergraduate computer science curriculum, but they've also been really successful in attracting new contributors to open source. And they've done this by developing a community that's really premised on accessibility and inclusion. And so if you haven't seen creative code before, it might look something like this, where creative coders write programs that generate this visual output. So here I'm editing a creative code program that was posted to the website Open Processing. And as I'm changing various numbers in the code, the visual output changes accordingly. So I'm changing the number of sides on this polygon and the number of bumps that are inside of it. And then I could choose to publish the changes I make as a new sketch. And this sort of repurposing of an existing program into a new one is called remixing. And people share their work in online communities, like Open Processing, which is shown here, which is accumulated over 1 million creative code programs since launching back in 2008. So in some empirical work, I analyzed the over 1.2 million projects on Open Processing to try and understand how creative coders are sharing and iterating on their projects. And again, I won't kind of dive into all the details of that study, but a key takeaway that I want to bring back to digital fabrication is to emphasize how the sort of fundamentally exploratory focus of creative code results in types of iteration and sharing that's very different than conventional software engineering. And so my argument here is that the success of large online creative code communities could be really usefully brought over to digital fabrication as we're thinking about how to share all these different experiments with different materials and machines. And I say that because replicating a design across different machines and materials is not a straightforward process. So in this image, I designed this original kind of basket woven looking print in PLA, which is a common material used in 3D printing, and using a machine that had a particular size nozzle that was 0.08 millimeters. And then in all these other prints here, I'm trying to replicate that design on different machines and different materials. And even after accounting for some common sense changes in variables, replication isn't immediate. It takes building up a good amount of intuition and changing a bunch of parameters to figure out how you can actually replicate that original design. And in fact, even once you tune things, it still looks a little bit different than however it started out with. And this can get even more exaggerated when you're printing unstandardized materials. So all of those materials I was just showing you could just buy online. But here I'm printing a homemade Play-Doh paste. And this is kind of altogether unlike a digital-only process, where if I am a creative coder sharing a sketch with someone, or even just writing a usual program, I could send it to someone else and reasonably expect it will do the same thing on their computer. But in digital fabrication processes, we have to go through this repeated trial and error process to make sense of this new material for our context. Like here when I'm trying to get that Play-Doh material to print and showing some of the changes that were indicative of what I had to do to replicate that design. And so to address this, I'm developing an online platform for sharing computationally fabricated objects. And the platform is inspired by Thingiverse, which I showed at the beginning of this presentation, as well as these large open source creative code communities. So the landing page of the website is shown here, where original projects are shown in blue and are in orange and remixes in blue, so you can quickly distinguish between the two. And if you click any project, you can read some information provided by the author about it, and you can see different forks or remixes that people have made of this particular design. And then we can open any project in an online editor where we can quickly change different parameters, and then using p5.fab, we can start streaming your changes directly to your machine. And we can also see different forks that people have made here through a little remix tree, where if you click on anything in this tree, you could go to that design and see what the differences were between theirs and yours. But forking a design for a physical object isn't like forking a usual code base. And so to try and support replication, I extended some end-user programming metaphors for application in fabrication. And so code diffs are commonly used to try and figure out what the differences were between two pieces of code. But programs that generate material output can only be read. They're only kind of legible alongside some picture or documentation of what it did. And so on the platform, I designed an interface for community members to pair code diffs with images. And so when you're replicating some workflow, other people can step through that code and see what can understand the physical changes or physical consequences of changing key parameters. And in addition to those remix trees, I also made remix graphs that were explorable by visitors. So in addition to finding an influential project quickly, we can also filter this graph based on data that's provided by authors. So for example, we could only look at projects which people have successfully made in particular materials, and then we could use those projects as starting points for our own remixes on our own machines. So I'm continuing to run online workshops to introduce people to this platform, and I think that platforms like this are going to be increasingly more important for digital fabrication because the creative possibilities of all these small-scale automation workflows aren't totally embodied just by machines or by software to control them, but instead hinge on practitioners who are developing new types of expertise that are blending manufacturing knowledge with their target domain. And so with this work, I'm hoping to cultivate an online community where all this knowledge can be openly shared. I'll end there for now, but I'm very interested in any comments or questions that people might have, and yeah, thanks for listening.